Hey everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Thrillogy podcast. My name's Cameron, and I am here with my two co-hosts,
Krista
and Morgan.
And we are so excited to be kicking off this podcast, and we thank you all for checking us out. We will be here every Monday with a new story involving true crime, conspiracies, or deep dives. And so with all that said, let's dive into today's story. Our first story begins with the case of Eva Blanco, a famous murder mystery that takes place in 1997 in Algete, Madrid, Spain. On April 19th, 1997, Eva spent her afternoon like most teens did, spending time with friends. They had kicked off the afternoon by playing tennis, and as the day went on, they ended up day drinking in a park and then eventually moving to a local bar, kind of like a nightclub, until around 11:30 p.m. Now, Eva's parents knew that she was out with friends, and Eva had promised her mom that she would return home by midnight. Eva had always gotten home by curfew, so when she didn't arrive, her mom became instantly worried. Shortly after midnight, when Eva still hadn't returned home, her mom decided to follow up with Eva's friends to see, if she was running late, if they were maybe still together. But there was already this nervous or even anxious feeling in the air, knowing that this was very unlike her daughter. After getting in touch with her friends, Eva's mom confirmed that one of the friends had last seen Eva at 11:45 p.m. when they had separated at a vacant lot less than half a mile from Eva's parents' house. Now, Eva had intended to cut through the vacant lot as she and her friends had done countless times before. This vacant lot, it was kind of like a little bit of a shortcut, and it would save some time versus walking through town. But unfortunately, this would be the last time that Eva was seen alive. As the night continued on, Eva's parents knew that something wasn't right, and her father, her cousin, a local police officer, and one of the fathers of Eva's friends had set out to look for any sign of her. By 1 a.m., with still no trace of their daughter, Eva's parents decided to go to the local police station and report her missing. However, to their shock, police didn't take this disappearance seriously and figured she was probably just passed out in a doorway somewhere, after her night out. And, realistically speaking, only an hour had passed. Now, after insisting that this wasn't like their daughter and that Eva had never broken curfew, local police started searching the area by 2:30 a.m. But even with the search, Eva Blanco wasn't officially reported missing until 8 a.m. And by noon the following morning, Eva's parents had actually asked for the public's help on the popular Telemadrid news channel because they hadn't heard from her and they hadn't seen any sign of her. Eva's parents were desperate looking for their daughter, and they felt like the local police weren't giving them the attention that they needed for Eva's disappearance. And it's really what ultimately led them to broadcast her disappearance on the news. Can you guys guess how many times Eva's father went to the local police station that morning? 15 times. 15 different times begging the police for their help, insisting that this was not normal behavior for Eva. Her parents would criticize the fact that police only searched by foot and didn't even do any in-vehicle searching until after sunrise. This ultimately meant that any rural roads that weren't in town were completely ignored until hours later. Police later negated these criticisms and commented that this was standard procedure in missing persons cases. And honestly, we see this so often in a lot of, U.S. Missing persons cases. I don't know. What do you guys think?
No, definitely we do see this a lot in the US. It makes me question what the written standard procedure is because when you have adults like parents or spouses, you kind of get the answer like, they chose to walk out, they abandoned their family. That's like the police first guess because they may not want to head out there right away. And then when you have teens, unfortunately, it's, okay, they ran away, they're angsty, just give them 48 hours when in reality, that's like the most crucial time.
Right, absolutely. And that's exactly what police said in the beginning too, right? When her parents went, they assumed the worst. They assumed that she was laying in a doorway, drunk after her night out. So, yeah, no, totally.
Well, I feel like another layer to this, as you guys were saying, like you hear so often about these crimes that aren't considered missing persons and they're not taken seriously when they should be. And it's actually really dangerous because at least in the US, it's a total myth that you need to wait 24 hours until someone's considered a missing person. And I actually heard that the first 72 hours someone is missing are actually really important because, of course, that person could be in danger or be move somewhere, and then you have way less of a chance of finding them. So it just adds to making the situation so much more dangerous and complicated.
Yeah, totally. And it's like that show, right? 48 hours. Like that whole show is focused on the fact that the first 48 hours are the most important. So yeah, no, totally.
And also to add to kind of what Morgan was saying, like they could be far within that, like given her age range and, she's a young girl, a young attractive girl, if she was kidnapped, that person could be out of the border in the first 24 hours. So definitely, especially Spain is so small, and then the next country would have to get involved. It was definitely a odd choice to wait this duration that they waited.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of times too, we take it for granted that today, in today's day and age, right, we have cell phones, we have different ways of tracking people's location. But like this was 1997. If she's gone for a couple hours, that really could be the difference of exactly what you said, being in Spain or being in Portugal or being in France or being taken to Morocco or, who knows. So yeah, totally. While her parents were pleading to the public for help locating their missing daughter, they were completely unaware that by 9 a.m., Eva's lifeless body had already been discovered some 3, almost 4 miles away by 2 elderly residents. Initially, the couple that discovered Eva's body thought that she had been run over, as she was found on the side of the road next to a construction site. But once the police arrived, they quickly realized that this was something much more sinister. Eva had been stabbed several times in the back, likely as she attempted to run from her attacker, possibly escaping the car that she had been kidnapped with. Now, I mentioned a car, and I know I haven't talked about a car yet, but this is because it would have been an incredibly odd place for Eva to have ended up on foot. And there were actually some slight tire marks, but it was hard to confirm if they were from that night or from a different time. Now, unfortunately for police, the early morning was incredibly rainy, and that rain had destroyed all vehicle tire marks and most other forensic evidence. The only clue that survived the rain were Eva's footprints and those of her attacker, size 9 shoe prints. By 3:30 p.m., the police had confirmed Eva's identity and had informed her parents. As you can imagine, her parents were absolutely devastated, but this seemingly random murder had the entire town saddened and enraged at the same time. See, we haven't really talked about this yet, but Algete is a very small, safe community within Madrid that had no recent history of violent crime. By 7 p.m., 200 of the 12,000 residents of Algete had gathered in front of the Blanco residence to mourn their loss. And during Eva's funeral, there were a total of 2,000 people in attendance, which we're talking about a town of 12,000 people. That's an insane number. Now, after Eva's autopsy, it was confirmed that she had indeed died after sustaining 19 stab injuries to the back, which eventually led to her death around 4 a.m. due to blood loss. After further investigation, they found that these wounds were caused by a navaja, which is like a traditional Spanish-style folding knife. It's kind of like almost like a larger, more ornate pocket knife. And the knife that was used to stab Eva was around 3 to 4 inches in length and about a 1/4 inch wide. Now, the autopsy had also reported finding semen in her mouth, vagina, and underwear, but despite the official report stating that the semen was from consensual sex, her parents maintained the belief that she was sexually assaulted on the night of her disappearance.
Wait, so they still believed after they had discovered she was stabbed that this was consensual?
Yeah, and it's really weird, and it's kind of what I thought too, but this brings us into the second point that when Eva's body was found, she was found dressed, and it really showed no signs of violence leading up to the murder. And both the coroner and the police officers actually believe that the sex had been consensual and that the murder could have been a result of, like an argument that happened after the fact. Despite that theory, though, Eva's parents still strongly believe that their daughter had been kidnapped and assaulted at knife point and then unfortunately murdered once everything was done. And last but not least, confirming the theory that she was taken in a vehicle, the medical examiner found a fiber from car upholstery in her mouth. Now, because the police thought this was like some sort of sexcapade and argument gone wrong, they assumed that this would be a short and easy to solve case. The police's main theory was that somebody known to Eva had approached her in a car, offered her a ride, and then took her to that construction site that I had mentioned earlier to have sex. Now, their first 2 suspects were Eva's recently ex-boyfriend and a new love interest. Both were quickly ruled out after some police interrogation and some DNA tests, and it kind of led to another dead end. With this said, this actually led Algete police to take an interest in the other men in Eva's life, especially because they were convinced that it had to have been somebody that she knew for her to get into the car voluntarily. After all, Eva's friends insisted that she would never accept a ride from a stranger. Over time, police began to secretly seek out DNA samples from Eva's family members, including her father. They even went as far as watching her father smoke a cigarette while drinking coffee at a local cafe and then grabbing the cigarette butt to test it for DNA. Other family members and close male friends also had their DNA taken from beer glasses and unrelated blood alcohol content tests, and still nothing. It was the case remained cold. Like I was saying, despite all of these DNA tests and local investigation, police officers were unable to find any suspects that seemed to match the details of the case. 8 months after Eva's murder, though, another mystery would surface. Eva's mother had found some of Eva's diaries, and both family and police went through them, hoping to find any sort of evidence that would lead them to the person who had murdered Eva. Now, these diaries, they weren't very different than what you would expect from a normal teenage girl, especially in 1997. Stories of her friends, drama, and of course, the name of Eva's boyfriend written over and over hundreds of times. One thing that stood out, though, is that on the last page of her diary, Eva had written Eva and 343110. And she wrote this 200 times with different colored pens. Now, previously, Eva had written Eva in the name of her boyfriend, something like Cameron and Krista, Cameron and Morgan. Now, investigators were confused as to what this 343110 number could mean, many believing it was code for something. Over the years, there have been a ton of online forums and discussion boards trying to decode this message, but what do you guys think it might be?
I don't know. I definitely feel like it's a code. Like it's someone, it has to do with someone that she shouldn't be speaking with. Like maybe a friend of hers is interested in this person, or maybe they're older than her, whatever it is. The reason it's in a code is because she doesn't want anyone to find out that she's talking to them. So I don't know what it could be though, because my first thought was like a screen name, but that was before that time.
Well, you actually might be onto something. I'll talk a little bit about what forums and discussion boards have said, but Krista, what do you think it might be?
I'm not sure. I was like, the screen name thing kind of crossed my mind as well, but like what Morgan said too, like it's 1997. I mean, you had a little bit here and there of like internet usage, but I don't know that she was delving into internet usage like that. I'm gonna probably go with like a classic teenage girl answer, which is probably like someone like Morgan said as well, not supposed to be talking to them, and that's her like code name that she uses. However, it decodes out to make sense. I'm not really sure about that part, but I'm definitely gonna agree with Morgan and the forbidden love, teenage love storyline.
Yeah. So over the years, there have been a ton of online forums and discussion boards trying to decode this message, like I had said before. But some of the most common thoughts are a phone number, which kind of makes sense because in Spain, you didn't have to dial 9 numbers if you were going to call somebody within the same province or the same state in 1997. And actually, here in Spain, phone numbers have basically the phone number is 3 sets of 3. So, if we're talking about the fact that you didn't have to dial, the first beginning part of it, maybe.
I almost feel like that's a little too straightforward though. Like, especially if this is just online discussions are still going back and forth about this. Like, wouldn't law enforcement or someone at this point already have run the number and figured that out?
That's so true. Yeah, that's a really good point. The next thing that people kind of go to, and this is a little bit of a weirder one and not something I would have ever guessed, but I guess in that year, the year that Eva had gone missing and was murdered, the company Coca-Cola had actually had a raffle and it gave away beepers or like pagers. And so what Eva's father actually believes is that the number could be associated with like a friend of hers who also won, one of those beepers or one of those pagers.
So in terms of the beeper theory, I could see like a teenage girl wanting to be a raffle winner. Like, I'm not sure in terms of dates, like where it fell. but I can see a teenage girl wanting to be a raffle winner and being like writing it over, like almost manifesting it in her own way. But then again, like 200 times or however many times she wrote it is definitely like in excess, but it's not far from reality for a teenage girl who wants a beeper, because we've seen teenage girls in that scenario.
So I'm kind of confused. Like, so did she win a beeper, or she's trying to win this beeper with this number? Like, what's the or this is someone else's beeper number?
So from my understanding, it was something that she had won, and this was something that she had. At least from my research and my investigation. So that's why Ava's father actually believes that it might be the beeper number of somebody else. Now, this kind of goes back to what you had mentioned with the phone number is, well, wouldn't law enforcement already run the number, right? But maybe during that time, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't as easy to do that, or they didn't think to do that. Like I don't know. It's hard to say. The next idea is that it could be a birth date. Now, this one's a little bit of a weird one because it would put the person, it would kind of make the murderer an older person. So people think that it would be like 1934, 31, and then 10, which, kind of makes sense. I could see it, but I'm not 100% sold on that one. What do you guys think?
It does kind of go back to the forbidden love thing. I'm just having a tough time believing, because if it was 1934 and we're talking about late 90s, that person would be in their 60s, like you were saying. So it does kind of go back to the forbidden love, but I'm having a tough time believing that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be like a teacher, she's like, he loves her, but again, like, I don't think that the birth date would be the first thing that they would go to. If the person was that old, like, how would she know their birthday? Like, just speaking about a teenage girl,
That's true.
If it was an older guy, how does she know his exact birth? Like, if it was a teacher or something, I don't know.
And for something like, an adult, I think that when it comes to teens and it's teen on teen and they don't want other people to know, they definitely go with codes. But I think when it comes to an adult, almost like a crush, you're going to be more like literally upfront with it, because you're manifesting it, you're daydreaming, you're not thinking about other people finding out or it being evidence in a crime. You're going to straight up write that person's name. So it definitely right there is like, I don't know about the birth date theory.
Yeah, I'm not sold on it either. The next idea is kind of like what you guys mentioned in the very beginning, a boy's name written in code, or a boy's name written not really in code, but like changing the letters for numbers. So like, for example, like, if you have the name Mike, it's M-I-K-E. So you might write it like M1K3 and it looks like Mike. I'm more inclined to believe that it's written in like her own made up code. Because if you look at this number and you think, okay, well, what would somebody's name be that fits the 343110? It just doesn't make sense. I mean, it would be like what? Aio? I mean, it's just not a name, So I don't know if I fully believe that either.
Yeah, I'm having a tough time believing that one too.
I'm looking actually at the note because I'm like getting into my head about it now, of course. And I'm thinking about like code names and then like what you said, Cameron, that kind of like M1, K3, like screen name trend we all did. And I'm not like, it kind of looks like it could be, to be honest, like a script Z, a Y, a Z, L, L, O. I mean, not to like go completely out of like the realm of like the 7 theories we've kind of laid out with Google, but like, that could be like Ava someone like either ZYZLLO or BYBLLO, which could be like in the last name territory. So again, not to go completely out of the box, but just like staring at this picture, I'm like, maybe it's not numbers. Maybe it's script. She has like super bubbly handwriting, so it's kind of hard. They look like B's or Z's.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And I didn't actually even think about that until I'm kind of looking at it again. And I think it's probably just because so many people just assumed, well, that's a 3, 4, 3, they just assumed that it was numbers and they didn't really think about it. But I could totally see it maybe being a name that was, written weird or maybe partially in code, maybe kind of even a combination of the two that we've talked about.
Definitely. Or like a nickname of that person or half last name, you shorten names, whatever.
And then finally, the last theory is that it could be like an IRC chat screen name or a number. Now, obviously in the US, I think it's fair to say that like in the late 90s, early 2000s, like AIM was super popular, MSN Messenger, Yahoo Messenger, those were very, very popular. But actually in Europe, I mean, obviously we have to remember that AIM wasn't a thing in Europe, right? Because it's America Online and, just doesn't really fit. But in Europe, a lot of people used ICQ before MSN Messenger was a thing. And ICQ, I don't know if you guys have ever used it before, but ICQ doesn't actually give you a screen name. It's actually a number. So people think that maybe this was, an ICQ number of somebody, maybe a boy that she was talking to. But during my research, I couldn't find any evidence that made me believe that she had like a easy internet access or easy computer access at home. I just couldn't find anything about it. So I don't know how valid that idea is, especially for it still being 1997. It's still pretty early.
Yeah, again, not to like overthink it at all, but like if you live in like even just anywhere outside of like the city, like even if you live in the suburb of Madrid, like you said, you probably don't have internet access as a teenager at home. That's something you might have at school or your parents have at work. I don't think your parents are investing in a computer or internet so their kid can sit at home chatting online in 97. So
yeah, right.
I'm not sure about the screen name.
Actually, I kind of believe this a little bit just because I'm thinking back. Like, yes, this was a very early time for instant messaging and the internet. But I mean, she does live right outside of a big city, right? So libraries around there would have computers. I mean, it's not too far-fetched. And like, I remember when I was younger, like my friends would find people on chat rooms and things like that. Like that was a thing that happened. That doesn't seem too far out of the realm of possibility to me, at least.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, now that you mentioned it, I try to think back and I try to think about when my parents first got internet access. I don't know if it was as early as 1997, but I do think it was still in the 90s, or at least like barely into the 2000s. And like, I'm originally from a very small town. And so it was kind of the same thing. So, you do have a really good point about her being right outside the capital city. So yeah, I don't know. That one kind of convinces me a little bit too, but I'm not 100% sure. Despite the theories over the years, nobody has been able to decode this number, and ultimately it led to another dead end in this case. After months and years with little to no movement in the case, Eva's father decided to petition for a mass DNA test of all male residents of Algete, and he did this in 1999. Now, believe it or not, and this was actually to my shock as well, this petition was actually backed by the Algete mayor at the time and initially called for all male residents over the age of 16 to provide hair or saliva samples. Now, this call, it was not mandatory, and I think that's very important to note, but assuming that all males over the age of 16 would submit their hair or saliva, that would result in like approximately 5,000 DNA samples, that's insane. Despite receiving over 2,000 samples from willing participants, Spanish judicial organizations criticized this movement as they considered it to be simple-minded, and they were concerned that it would create a potential stigma for residents who refuse to provide a DNA sample. What do you guys think? Because I think this was a smart idea from Eva's father. I actually agree with the Spanish judicial organizations because I just can't imagine that anyone who is actually guilty of her murder would realistically submit their sample. I mean, after all, we know that testing, even just one DNA sample, takes a lot of money and resources. So I just can't imagine how they would realistically test so many different DNA samples.
This is so hard because I feel for their family. Like if I were in their shoes, I'd probably want the entire country tested. At the same time, I agree, anyone guilty would definitely not agree to give their DNA. But my first thought is like, remember that case where a family member of someone who committed a crime gave their DNA to 23andMe and like they were somehow linked back to the crime? Like, a super old cold case was solved because of 23andMe. And like, I know this is totally different in a totally different time, but even at that time, I'm not sure if finding the criminal's family member would be totally out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's an excellent point. Like if it happens today, I mean, it could easily happen then, especially because people didn't move as much as they do today. People are much more mobile today. Maybe not in 2020 and 2021, but in general, people are much more mobile than they used to be. So yeah, totally.
Yeah, I'm also wondering like what type of crime rate they had in the area that they would assume the best of people to provide their DNA. You're just assuming the best, that people will just willingly give you their DNA and incriminate themselves. However, though, Morgan was doubting that someone would provide their DNA as a guilty person, but we've seen cases too where the killer hides in plain sight. They go to the vigils, they, ask the police, is there anything I can do? They're a friend of the family and they're bringing food and they're providing support. Mind you, they're the guilty party from day one. So, you might catch someone slipping, trying to be slick, especially in 97 where DNA maybe wasn't like truly known like we know it now. We see it on TV, we hear it in the news, we hear it on the radio. It's second nature to us, but over 20 years ago, it probably wasn't. And then I also want to think about not necessarily what their crime rate may have been, but again, they may be setting a precedent. Like we have a low crime rate, and if you do this in our province or our town, you're not getting away with it. Like we're requesting DNA from wherever we can get it, and you will be caught. So kind of making an example of this case. Unfortunately, sometimes that's harder on the family, but again, just setting precedent.
Yeah, no, totally. I think both of those are possibilities, right? And I mean, it's just like you said, so many people hide in plain sight. So yeah, totally, it's definitely an option. But at the end, when all was said and done, the examining magistrate of Eva's case decided that testing should only be done on samples of those who could be potential suspects. And this basically meant that they only wanted to test the samples from the closest people in Eva's life, and then the samples from any Aljete resident that had a previous criminal record, specifically related to knife or sexual violence. Now, with all these people being tested, they ended up testing 45 DNA samples, which I mean is a lot less than the 2,000, 5,000 number that we had been throwing around before, but it is still an incredible number of DNA samples to be tested, especially in 1997. With all of that said, though, the case remained cold. By 2007, over 30 police officers had worked on Eva's case, but despite years of investigation, police were still as confused as they were in 1997, with the one exception of a piece of evidence that had come to light. Now, during DNA testing, investigators had concluded that the DNA that was found on the crime scene from Eva's attacker was not of European descent, which obviously helped narrow down potential suspects, but there still wasn't very much progress. As a matter of fact, in 2013, investigators had actually continued to test various DNA samples from men who lived in the surrounding area of Aljete, but nothing until 2013, when another piece of evidence would come to light. On April 26, 2013, La Sexta, which is a very popular TV station in Spain, aired an episode about Eva's case on their show Equipo de Investigación, which is like a true crime, basically what we're doing. It's just a TV show about true crime in old cases, and they really hope to bring some renewed media attention and focus to Eva's murder, which we've seen done in so many cases before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that with true crime, especially as of recently, I'm seeing a lot of controversy surrounding it. People assuming like, the wounds of victims and their families is the entertainment of others. But I think it's actually so much more, because in a case that's unsolved or just cold for so many years, it's almost very important to get like fresh minds, fresh eyes on the case, updated technology, especially with the DNA history of this case. So I think it was a really good choice of the producers to pick this case, however many years later, to, like I said, just bring fresh, renewed eyes onto the case.
So it did that. It actually worked. It did exactly what you had mentioned. And after seeing the episode about Eva's case, a woman had actually called authorities to report that she had seen a suspicious man near the construction site where Eva was murdered around 8 a.m. Now, this man, he was seen walking in the rain without an umbrella and looked like he had barely slept that night. The woman who had called authorities also remarked that it appeared that the mystery man was looking for something before getting into a white car, a Renault 18. Now, the police had to actually take in this potential witness pretty seriously as they had received other reports about this same vehicle. And you guys remember that fiber that was found in Eva's mouth at the crime scene? Well, that fiber was a match to the fibers that were normally used in the upholstery of that make and model car in 1997. Now, because police were so confident in this new witness, they brought her in, and on October 28th, 2013, police released a composite sketch of what the potential suspect might look like. He was said to be between 35 and 40 years old, around 5 feet, 10 inches tall, 165 to 175 pounds, with short, spiky brown hair, a square and hardened face, dark, sunken eyes, and wearing a white shirt and V-neck sweater. A confidential phone number and email address were provided for possible tips, and by January 1st, 2014, over 100 emails had been received. Now, unfortunately, all of these tips that were received via email ended up not leading to anything that investigators didn't already know. To the public, it seemed like the case remained cold. What people didn't know, however, is that at the same time during the end of 2013, investigators were looking into the DNA sample that was found at the crime scene. Not only had they determined that it wasn't of European descent, like I had actually mentioned earlier, but they had narrowed it down enough, and they knew that the DNA belonged to a man of North African descent. Now that police knew more specifically who they were looking for, they petitioned for voluntary DNA samples from any Algete resident of North African descent that lived in the small town during Eva's murder. Surprisingly, the response was overwhelmingly positive by the residents, and this actually created doubt among the investigators because, again, why would anybody who was guilty willingly submit their DNA for testing?
I want to kind of go back to what Morgan said about the 23andMe, and I'm just thinking that a lot of people probably willingly submit samples because they don't realize that there's parts of DNA that can link you to your relatives. So while you're not a 100% match, you might provide the 80% match that they need to hone in on you and then ask about family members. So I think that might be probably on the top list of reasons why people actually might willingly submit their DNA, because they're like, oh, I'm innocent, and they don't realize what it could lead to.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, it's you never really know people, right? Even your own family, sometimes you don't really know who they are and what they're capable of. And it's funny that you mentioned that, and it's even funnier that Morgan brought it up earlier, because after they did this DNA test, they finally hit their big break in the case. The DNA of Fouad Chel, a former resident of Eva's neighborhood, had a 97% DNA match to the murderer.
I knew it.
You weren't wrong. You weren't far off. Now, obviously 97%, that doesn't mean that he did it. But what this concluded was that his level of a DNA match would only be possible if his brother was Eva's murderer. Fouad had two brothers, one living in Murcia, Spain, and the other living in France. Now, the brother who lived in Murcia never actually lived in Algete. But because he was already in the country, they obviously tested his DNA. And as you can imagine, it was not a match. This meant that the DNA had to be a match to the third brother living in France. So finally, after 18 years, Ahmed Chel was arrested outside of his workplace in France. Ahmed Chel was 52 and was born in Tassa, Morocco, and was 52 when he was arrested, meaning that he would have been 34 years old at the time of the murder. You see, he had actually married a Spanish woman from Madrid in the 90s, and that's why he was living there. Now, the reason he was never listed as a resident of Algete in 1997 was because they lived in a caravan parked in a plant nursery where Chel worked as a delivery man. And you can imagine the caravan was parked only 2 miles from where he murdered Eva.
So I don't know if it's related, but again, I'm going back to the note because I'm fixated on the note. And I don't know if anyone's ever mentioned this or if they've ever questioned, is this someone that she knew or is this a complete stranger? But I just want to point out that if we go back to the number theory on the note from the diary, it starts off with what they think might be 3-4. And I just want to point out that he was 34 years old at the time of the murder. Again, not sure if that's something they've ever looked at, if they know each other, but definitely an interesting coincidence.
That is very interesting. And I actually didn't even realize that. Maybe as the story goes on, and I'm going to share a little bit more, he was really hard to get information out of, but we'll kind of learn a little bit more as we go through the rest of the story. Now, in 1999, Ahmed would move him and his family to France. And it's kind of suspicious. I'm actually kind of surprised he didn't leave earlier, to be honest, considering that this took place in 1997. But as we know, the months after the murder, that's when police were really putting a lot of emphasis. So part of me wonders if all of that focused police and investigative, attention on the case is what ultimately led him to want to leave, right? I mean, it makes the most sense. Now, when Ahmed was questioned by police as to why his DNA was on the crime scene, he had actually told them that he had walked there by two friends who then proceeded to force him to masturbate on top of Eva's body. Now, I think it's fair to say police knew that this was a lie, and actually when asked, Ahmed had no answer for how his DNA was found inside of her. Very quickly, being caught in his conscious feeling with guilt, or at least that's what I like to think, but maybe it was just him not wanting to spend his life locked up, it caught up to him. And on October 5th, he was found in his cell after unsuccessfully trying to slit his throat in a suicide attempt. His answers and this whole charade and obviously the suicide attempt, it didn't work on the judge, because Ahmed had actually wanted to be released into the general public. He wanted to be released pending trial, and the judge was like, no way, you are going to stay in prison until you are on trial. And so only 2 days later, he was deported back to Spain, where he was then sent back to Spanish prison. Now, obviously, with everything that had happened, Chell was on suicide watch pending the trial, but he was removed from suicide watch after being evaluated by therapists and psychologists, and he was removed off of suicide watch on January 6, 2016. Unfortunately for Eva's family, they would never see justice, as Ahmed was found hanged in his prison cell by his own shoelaces on January 29th. But at least her killer would be known. I know these kind of cases, at least for me personally, they drive me nuts, because we were so close to having justice for Eva. And it was one of those situations where once, we were so close to having that justice, they decided to take the easy way out. And this is something that I actually didn't touch on during the story, but in Spain, and I'm not 100% sure if it's still the case, but at least during the story, Spain has a statute of limitations on murder of 20 years. And as we know, Eva was murdered in 1997. So when all of this happened, it was only 2 years before the statute of limitations ran out. So they were so close to finally getting justice for her. But yeah, like I said, it's one of those situations where I think he just, he didn't want to face up to what he had done. What do you guys think?
For me, part of it is so hard because of the justice thing. They were so close. And then also it just leaves more questions for me, honestly. Like, because he wasn't willing to talk, we don't really have that closure. And I'm sure, Ava's family also doesn't have this closure of where this man came from. Did she know him? What the code was? Like, there's so many unanswered questions that he kind of robbed her family of, aside from the justice piece of it, which is like, I don't know, which is worse for me. But it's hard, hearing all of these clues, the questions that come up, and, the ending for me is so abrupt, and it leaves a lot of things unsolved.
Okay, I want to say shame on the jail system for taking this individual off suicide watch. I didn't quite catch the window that he was on the watch from, but I want to include that being on the watch, besides getting evaluated by medical professionals, is simply a guard passing by your cell at least every 15 minutes, and sometimes it's actually 2 on 1, so it'll be 1 inmate in the cell and 2 people outside. So that could have prevented this in so many ways, could have prevented his suicide, obviously. And the jail completely, their irresponsibility impeded the family from ever seeing justice. not to like pump conspiracies into this poor girl's case, but I just, again, I knowing how, we've seen other cases, other perpetrators timeline. Sometimes they say that this person hanged themselves and they actually didn't. They may have been killed by another inmate. I mean, this guy definitely would be at risk of that, killing a young girl. That's an absolute no-no. A guard that's completely upset by the case, disgusted, kind of like a vigilante taking it into his own hands, or just, a fight. Like they will do anything to save face, the justice system. And I'm just saying.
No, yeah. And I think that's a good point because it is so close, and you never really know. I would be hesitant to believe that. I'd be hesitant to believe that it was the justice system that didn't, that caused this in some way. Mostly because I think this would be good press. I hate saying that it would be good press, when somebody's life was lost. But when we're talking about solving such an it's such a cold case, and with such little time left before the statute of limitations runs out, I don't think that it would be something with the justice system. But I am more inclined to believe that maybe it was another inmate, and it is something to be noted. And obviously, I don't have a ton of experience on prisons in Spain. I've never been to one. I don't plan on going to one, but in general, prisons outside of the U.S. and in Europe in general tend to be a little bit more liberal, I guess you could say. They're a little bit more free. Now, I don't know exactly what kind of, security he was in. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know 100% what Spanish prisons are like. So I almost wonder if maybe it was just he was given too much freedom, or even like you said, there just wasn't somebody watching there. Somebody wasn't paying enough attention to him. So yeah, it definitely is frustrating at the end, but at the very least, Eva's family knows who did it. And I think that is better than never knowing at all.
I would be curious to know like what listeners think too, like in terms of what we were just saying, kind of not necessarily conspiracies, but theories that we do have about surrounding Ahmed in the jail. Like, do you think it was, intentional straight up suicide, or do you think that it's a cover up for something more? I would definitely be curious to see what other people have to say, especially people coming from Spain or Europe that may, unfortunately know more about the jail system there, kind of like what type of watch he would be under, and kind of use that knowledge to like let us know a theory. Like I'd definitely be curious because I also don't know anything about Spanish prisons.
Yeah. Like I said, I've never been and I don't plan on it anytime soon. So. But yeah, no, that's a great point. Let us know what you think. As always, we're on social media, and you can always shoot us an email as well, or a voice message on Anchor, sharing your opinions. And, we're happy to share those in the next podcasts. But thank you, everyone, for listening and accompanying us for today's story.
As always, you guys can keep up with all things Thrillogy on social media at ThrillogyPod, and make story requests on thrillogypodcast.com.
Each week, we will be releasing 2 hints, so you can try to guess the following week's podcast subject. So, your first hint is, what happens on the ice stays on the ice. Be sure to check out our Instagram for another hint later this week, and let us know if you think you've guessed it.